Thanks, Deb. Actually, you could probably say LSU and Mike wouldn't bother, but if you said Texas or if you said Texas Tech or any other place, you'd have some problems. All right. Let's see. We are going to do the fall of Babylon tonight, and we are going to get into the Persian period. But let me just hit a couple of real quick high points. And in the handouts, this slide number 4, the silent years, kind of lays out the best of the timelines for what we're looking at. And we are going to get into the silent years, this 400-year period. But I wanted to note a few highlights on just this slide. If you go down to after the bullet points, you'll see some numbered items there. And the reality is, and I've said several times, that God's preparing Israel for what's going to happen when his son arrives and what's going to happen for 100 years after that. And actually, what's going to happen for the rest of the time up to today as we know it. But those last 6 or so items give you a pretty good idea of what we see here. And I want to just hit those. It's a time when God's people were ruled by others. Now, I made the comment last week that Palestine, there's a misconception when people talk about Palestine. They say, well, Palestine should be returned to the Palestinian people. Palestinian people never had Palestine. From the time of the fall of Israel on, the area of Palestine, or what we would recognize as Israel, has been occupied by other people from the time of in fact, before that, from the time of the Babylonians through the time of the Greeks, through the time of virtually every conquering nation you can possibly think of, the last of which would have been the Ottoman Empire. It was never a nation, and the Palestinian nation never existed. So it's kind of a misnomer to say that it should be returned to the Palestinian people. You can't return something that never belonged to them to begin with. So this is a time when God's people are going to be ruled by others. And as I pointed out, they will be up until 1948 when partition occurs. The second thing is it's a time when the Jews were dispersed. And part of the reason we've talked about the Assyrians and the Babylonians is that's when a major portion of the dispersion takes place. The diaspora, meaning the dispersion of the Jews around the world. And we'll talk more about how critical that is in the spread of the gospel. Because when Paul goes in to all of the churches that he goes to, where does he go first? He doesn't go to First Baptist Church. He goes to the synagogue, right? Well, guess what? Guess who's in the synagogue? Jews who have been dispersed, many of which show up on when the Holy Spirit shows up as well when the church is first started in chapter 2 of Acts. So that's the second point. The third is the time when Roman roads gave worldwide access. We talked about that as well. If you had some things that you wanted to make sure happened, if you were going to go do a mission trip, one of them would be some way to get around. So now you've got 2 ingredients, somebody that can help you, the dispersion, and the roads to get around. And then we hit in the fourth item, we hit one of the more important items, and that is the Greek language being spread worldwide. So the last 2 are a time of Jewish synagogue, a place to meet, and then finally, the fullness of time of the coming of Jesus. If you just look at that slide, you get a real good overview of what's happened or what is happening in the intertestamental period. Now, let's move on then, because last week we talked about the fall of the Assyrian Empire. This week, we're going to spend just a little time on the fall of the Babylonian Empire, and we're going to use some prophecy to talk about that, but I wanted to note something even before I did that. Let's go to this slide. This is slide 7 in your handy-dandy packet. I want you to notice something here. You can see, if I can get over there, hard for me to see. Is that Nineveh? Should be somewhere in that area. Nineveh, that's the capital of Assyria. Babylon is the capital of capital of Babylon. If we were to move a little, it's not quite on this slide, if we were to move a little further east, you know what we would hit? Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. Now, they're all kind of grouped right together, aren't they? Well, let me ask you a question. What is right about here? Aside from my big pointer. Pardon?
Pretty close.
How about if I said Ur of the Chaldees? Does that ring any bells with anybody? Abraham, right? Don't you think it's a little weird that we have kind of a family feud here? These are all cousins. These all come from Noah's son, and that's going to be where they all start. How come then we're talking about Israel at all?
Because God chose Abraham.
He goes to Ur of Chaldees and he says, Abraham, I want you to go someplace you don't even know about yet. I'm going to lead you there, and I'm going to establish a nation around you. But it's always been interesting to me that Israel's biggest problems have come from those that were the closest to him. Moab, Ammon, Esau's people, Edom. All of those are relatives. I just got to thinking, well, it's not such a stretch after all. I'm thinking of my relatives. Now that I think about it, it's not a stretch at all. But it's interesting to me that all of these people are, if you go back far enough, are going to be interrelated. Now, in talking about Babylon, I want to start first with a couple of notes about prophecy. And here's what I want you to know. Let's see. What's the first thing, if I say prophecy, what's the first thing you think of?
Foretelling.
Revelation, foretelling. You know what this is. So, Revelation, most people think of Revelation, right? Or Daniel, right? Or Ezekiel, or Jeremiah. We think of the prophets, right? And what do we think of? Them seeing the future, right? Well, in both Hebrew and Greek, the term for prophecy actually means foretelling, which is seeing the future, and forthtelling, proclaiming or proclamation. In other words, it has very little to do with foretelling the future. What it has to do with is proclamation of the Lord's word. There's about 1,800 prophecies in the Bible, about half of which have been fulfilled. Those are foreseeing the future. It occupies about 27% of the Bible. Prophecies, seeing the future, occupies about 27% of the Bible. Well, do a little math here. If 27% is prophecy, what's the other 73%? Forthtelling. It's proclamation, right? Now, obviously, there's some other genres mixed in there, but the point is this. We tend to focus so much on prophecy, on seeing the future, that we neglect to discuss the part of prophecy that's the most important, and that is foretelling or forthtelling the word of God and the coming of Jesus. That's the big job of most prophets. So we want to make sure and distinguish between foretelling and forthtelling. Now, with Daniel tonight, and what we're going to look at, we're going to be looking at foretelling for sure, but we can't ever ignore that Daniel is also forthtelling to Nebuchadnezzar and to those who follow him who his God Yahweh is. Doesn't have anything to do with them prophesying the future. What it has to do with is saying to Nebuchadnezzar, you know who interpreted this dream? Wasn't me. It was God. That's forthtelling. So make sure you distinguish those two things, because we often get so tied up in the foretelling part of it that we neglect the forthtelling. That's the first thing I wanted you to notice. Here's the second thing, and I can thank Sarah for this. Last week, you don't even know what you're getting thanked for, do you? Last week, we had a little discussion after we met, and she talked about, was it your dad that talked about the mountains? Yes. Now, give me the context and what he said.
Like I was reading through Isaiah and I was like, I don't understand how Isaiah is jumping here from talking about Babylonian versus talking about Jesus coming back. And he said that the prophets see when they're foretelling, they're often seeing it like a mountain range. Like you see one mountain and then one behind it, but you can't tell the valleys in between and how much time is in between. They just saw what was, not exactly when it was going to happen, what mountain was in front of the other.
That's perfect. And I volunteered that. I told her I usually wake up about 4:30, so I volunteered in the morning. So I volunteered to go to her house and say, let's go look at the mountains and I'll kind of explain it to you. That didn't happen. So here's what I want you to do, because what she's talking about is absolutely true. Now, not all prophecy is this way, but much prophecy has a near-term fulfillment and a long-term fulfillment. We're going to see that in Daniel later on. So the image that's usually used is if you went out and looked at a mountain range, like if we went up to Fort Lewis right now and looked up the valley, we'd see a bunch of mountains and we'd think, wow, they're all right there. You start driving through them and what happens? Suddenly one's, 20 miles further past the other one. And if your eyes could see further, it'd be even further past. So prophecy is often near term, the prophet seeing a near-term fulfillment and a long-term fulfillment. So as we go through this, I want you to remember that. And we're certainly going to see it in Daniel when we get to the abomination that causes desolation, part of Daniel's prophecy. So the two things to keep in mind about prophecy is the first one is foretelling and forthtelling. The second one is the mountain ranges. Everybody following me? All right. Now, let's start then with Daniel's prophecy. Let me set the stage first. And while I'm doing that, it should be in your notes. I need somebody to read Daniel 2:36 through 45 in just a few minutes. Let me set the stage first, and then we're going to read it, and we're going to look at a slide that will help us with that. We talked about last week about Judah, kind of falling to the Babylonians in three stages. The first one is going to be 605 BC. When Nebuchadnezzar comes into to the southern kingdom, and he takes part of them, because it's over a period of time, he takes part of them back into captivity. In that first group is going to be Daniel in 605 BC. Now, we don't know his exact age, but based on the fact that he's called a young man, most people would put him somewhere between the ages of 14 and 17. He's carried into captivity. And in chapter 2, we're going to get this. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And you've all heard about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Nebuchadnezzar has, in the meantime, has made Daniel. He hasn't made Daniel yet. He's asked Daniel to be one of the people who's going to learn to serve in his court, right? Pretty big deal for a 17-year-old kid who's coming from a tiny little place called Israel. Nebuchadnezzar, at this point, if we just look at the map, Nebuchadnezzar is the most important man in the world, or the known world of what we're talking about. And he's got this guy, Daniel, 17-year-old kid. So he has this dream. He also has a bunch of other seers around him. He has this dream, and he calls everybody in, and he's really disturbed by this dream. And he says, I had a dream last night. I want you to tell me what the dream is and interpret it. And all of the seers say, tell us the dream, and we'll give you the interpretation. And he said, no, I want you to tell me what I dreamed, and then I want you to interpret it for me. And he says, if you don't, it's kind of like off with your heads. It's like the Queen of Hearts. Daniel is going to be kind of included in this group. So Daniel goes to his overseer and he says, I can't do this, but I know someone who can. And he asks for a day before he goes back before Nebuchadnezzar. This is one of the first places we're going to see God's hand in what's going to occur during this period of time. I want you to remember this as well. Daniel doesn't just serve the Babylonians. He also is called into service by the Persians. By the time he's called into service by the Persians, he's somewhat older, but by the time when he's called into Babylon service, keep in mind he's a 17-year-old kid. So, did somebody look at Daniel 2:36 through 45? Eileen, do you want to read it nice and loud?
I don't know about the loud. This was a dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your Majesty, you are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands you have placed all mankind, and the beasts of the field, and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of the world. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to you. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. And it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay, as the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with the baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those and bring them to an end. It will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. That's what he said.
That's fine. That's great. Did you notice a little bit about what's happening here? Well, Daniel's foretelling the future, isn't he? What's he also doing? He's foretelling God Yahweh. He's saying, I can't do this, but my God can. And then he foretells a dream. Remember, he doesn't know what the dream is. Nobody knows what the dream is. But Daniel, under God's providential guidance, not only knows what the dream is, he knows what the interpretation is. And he has to be successful, or what? We wouldn't be reading the story, would we? Because he would have been, he would have had his head lifted just like all the others would have. So Daniel now has set the stage for us in prophecy to see all the kingdoms that we're talking about. And on this, if you keep any of them, this is probably the one you want to keep because you're given all the citations that you're going to need for in Daniel for the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. And then ultimately, you'll notice the bottom, there's one more empire, one more kingdom, isn't there? That's the kingdom yet to come. That's what Daniel's talking about. So, we'll come back to it. Daniel's an interesting book because the first six chapters are primarily historical in nature. The last 6 chapters, which are in Hebrew, the first 6 chapters were written originally, most people believe, in Aramaic, the language of the Babylonians. The last 6 chapters are written in Hebrew. And if you go look at the last 6 chapters, you're going to find they all deal with prophecy of what's going to happen in Israel. So in the first 5 chapters, think about those mostly as historical. We're going to come back to it a little bit later. In chapter 5, we're going to deal with it a little bit more in one of the historical pieces of the puzzle. And then the last 6 chapters, the prophecy is going to be primarily in Hebrew. Excuse me. But what Dale?
In verse 43, who's the they?
Read it, Dale. Read both.
As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay.
Meaning the two elements. I don't think
Yeah,
it's
just
all
all the
person.
different people.
Oh, you know, do you remember when we talked about questions at our opening class? Did everybody remember that? And what did we talk about? If we didn't know the answer right then, what was going to happen?
Jeff will look it up.
Yeah. So Dale, how would you like to come back next week and do a...
I know I won't be here next week.
Okay, Jeff.
Wouldn't it be the divided?
It's probably going to be, and if we get to that point, is he dealing with the Romans yet? In that section? Who's he dealing with?
Well, yeah, I think it's.
Yeah. He's dealing with whatever happens after the Roman Empire, whoever this is going to be. And if we start dealing with the prophecy of who the Romans are and who the church was and who the Antichrist was, they're going to be here forever. So I'll look it up to make sure, Dale, but that's probably going to be a consortium of those after the Roman period. Pretty easy way to get out. I know that you waited to ask a question until the week that you weren't going to be here. Is that pretty accurate?
It's called wisdom.
Let me make a note here. All right. So now let's move into the Persian period. I want to make a few points about this. Here's the first. Persia is Iran. Interestingly enough, it was called Persia up until 1935. The name was changed back to Iran primarily by a group of what would become mullahs, I guess you would call them mullahs, who said they wanted to get back to the original name of what Iran was. Persia had been called Persia from the time of just before Alexander the Great on, and in the time of Alexander the Great, it was pretty much ingrained that it would be called Persia, and up until 1935 it was. But this group wanted to return to the name that the indigenous people called it, derived from the word Aryan, directly linking its country to its roots. So the step was part of a broader effort to modernize the country and instill a unified sense of pride among its citizens. So when you see Persia, think of Iran. At this point, Daniel's probably in his 80s. So we've jumped forward quite a bit. In the meantime, if you want to finish reading the book of Daniel, here's what you're going to find. Nebuchadnezzar names him his number one guy, his number one emissary. You might think of him as Secretary of the State. I want you to think about that too. A 17-year-old kid, and he's given the keys to the empire at 17. Got to be something pretty special about that, don't you think? I know when I was 17 what I was thinking about. My Latin test.
Yeah, right.
So now we're going to skip forward. David?
This may be a stupid question, but who's Nebuchadnezzar? Is he the king of the Babylon?
Yes, he is. Yep.
Okay, and so then he's giving.
Yep. He's not inheriting with the kingship. What he's saying is, you're going to be my right-hand man. Nebuchadnezzar is still going to continue to be king, as will, in fact, we're going to get to his grandson here in just a minute, Belshazzar, and so he'll remain the king, but he's going to say, you're to take charge of all, and Darius's time, they're going to be called satraps. So you might think of them as little state governments all over the place. Daniel just got through telling him a dream that only he knew and interpreting for it. He's saying this guy knows something.
So God said Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar?
No. He sends just Nebuchadnezzar the dream.
Oh.
And then Daniel says, I don't know what your dream is, but give me the night. I'm going to go pray to my God. He's going to reveal to me what it was you dreamed.
Oh.
So it would be like me saying, you coming to me and say, tell me what I dreamed last night and interpret it.
I don't know.
I'm not going to have a clue, right? Daniel didn't have a clue, but who did?
Since God is sovereign.
So he's the one that said, Daniel, here's what he dreamed, and here's the interpretation.
Apparently, Daniel took some people with him in that journey. Because we, I'd like to know who the we were.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's who I'm going with.
That's what it says.
Yeah. So now, let's, as I said, we're going to skip forward a bit. Daniel's now probably in his 80s. So we're going to skip forward quite a bit from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's probably in his 80s. Let me set the stage again, and then we'll read part of it. King Belshazzar is the last king of Babylon. Probably, although they aren't sure, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And we get the famous handwriting on the wall. Anybody ever heard that before? You can see the handwriting on the wall. By the way, I've always been interested in where we get certain phrases from, because you hear them and you think that's from the Bible. You know, there's over 300 sayings that we use today that come directly out of the Bible. A lot of times used by people who've never even opened the Bible, but it's kind of ingrained in our society. Let me give you just a few of them. I think you'll find this interesting. Brian, this one's for you. A fool and his money are soon parted. How about this one? A little bird told me. Right? Ecclesiastes. Let's see. How about, it's about a stone's throw from here. Well, that's in Luke 22. A time to be born and a time to die. That's from the Byrds in their famous song. And at least 3 people in this room are going, I have no idea what you're talking about. The Byrds did a song called Turn, 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 which is based on the book of Ecclesiastes, and that's where it comes from. How about this one? I am my brother's keeper. An eye for an eye. Exodus. I should probably flesh that one out just a little bit. You always get people saying, especially if they're trying to denigrate the Bible, if it's an eye for an eye, all you do is end up with a bunch of blind people. The reason that's there was to limit retribution. It's called lax talionis. In other words, the crime should fit the punishment. And the reason it's in there is because in biblical times and during the time of Exodus, if someone committed a sin against someone else, let's just say that somehow somebody killed the brother of somebody else. Well, what would in turn happen would be that family would go wipe out the entire family of the perpetrator. So lax talionis, or the eye for the eye principle, is the crime should fit the punishment. No more, no less. And that'd be a great concept for this country. There could occasionally be opinion in this class. I'm not saying the opinion is correct, but it usually is. Sorry, guys, keep working with me here. Let me give you a couple of others. The apple of my eye. It's in Deuteronomy, it's in Psalms, it's in Zechariah. There's over 300. And how many of you, if you tell me you've never heard this, I'm going to be really surprised. How many of you have never heard of the handwriting on the wall? Well, we'll tell you what it's about because it's pretty interesting. In fact, Sarah? You haven't either? Well, you're about to hear it. And I think you'll find it interesting. Let's see. Is this, Emily, is this you? Chapter 5, 23 to 31.
But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, and wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, whose are all your ways, you have not honored. And from his presence the hand was sent,
and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed. Many, many, tekel and parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Many, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Aries, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
So to kind of flesh this out and make it make a little more sense, what Emily just read is what Daniel says to Belshazzar. Well, why is Belshazzar even there and asking the question? Here's what's happened. He's in the party hall having a big party, and all of a sudden, this disembodied hand appears, and it begins to write something on the wall. I don't know about you guys, but if I see a disembodied hand start to write something on the wall, it's going to get my attention. Well, it does, and it gets the attention of virtually everybody in the party, right? So Belshazzar says, somebody tell me what it says. And nobody can do it, including all of his seers. Nobody can tell what it is. Well, the queen mother says, I can tell you somebody who can. And at this point, you're given the impression that Belshazzar maybe not even know who Daniel is, because he's a couple generations removed. So he says, well, tell me who it is. And she said, send for Daniel. So he sends for Daniel. Daniel comes in, and part of the issue is the party that's going on is taking place with all the holy implements that should have been in the tabernacle. That's what they're using. They're drinking out of cups and whatever else. So Daniel comes in, and he's not too pleased, but all he really does is, I want you to understand what's going to happen. And he interprets what that dream is. And the dream is written, I think it might have been in Hebrew, I don't recall. And the words that Emily just read are all that's written. Many, many, pickle, parsin. I want you to notice a couple things about this. Well, first of all, anybody that's been in this class, if there's repetition in the Bible, what does it mean?
Emphasis.
It's emphasis, right? If you see something repeated in the Bible twice, that's important. If you see something repeated 3 times, you better sit up and take notice. The first 2 words are repeated, or the first word is repeated. Many, many. And what is it?
Numbered.
God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an
God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an
end.
end. That's the first thing he says. He says it twice. So what's he saying? Buddy, get ready, because this is not going to be a pleasant period. And then he goes on and he says, not only that, I'll tell you who's going to do it. Parsin are the Persians. There's a couple of different definitions for the word, but basically it's the Persians. So the handwriting on the wall then was the disembodied hand that God sent to warn Belshazzar what's about to happen to him. And if we go back and look at our statue, we're going to see the Babylonian kingdom falls that night. Now, I do want to point out a couple of things that you might find interesting. In your notes, by the way, I think I have 450 BC. It's actually 538 BC is when this occurs. The reason I have 450 in there is that's about the time of the return of Ezra from the exile. So the timing is Ezra returns out of exile in about 450, but the Persians come to rule in 538, 539. So now, before we move on a little bit, would you like to know, has anybody ever wondered, because this happens overnight. Somehow the Persians are able to defeat the Babylonians overnight. Anybody know how? I know you know, Dale.
Through the river.
Underneath. They do. They go through the river. Babylon was built spanning the Euphrates River. Half of it on one side of the Euphrates River, the other half on the other side of the Euphrates River. So the Persians had actually been battling against them for some time, but they were not able to penetrate the defenses of the Babylonian Empire. So of the Babylon. So in these thick walls. So Cyrus the Great, I do have to tell you, there's a couple of different stories on this, but Herodotus, the Greek historian, records that what happened was Cyrus the Great, or his generals, diverted the water of the Euphrates River, dried up enough of the Euphrates River that they were able to march under the gates that protected the openings where the Euphrates went through. So they were able to march through under the gates into the city and virtually take it overnight with well, I started to say without a shot fired, but how would they have fired? Never mind. How about this? Without a bow strung. That's even better, don't you think? So if you ever get a chance, you want to read the history of it. It's a pretty impressive history to read. That's how the Persians take the empire of the Babylonians. And here's what we end up with. This is the Persian period. We're going to start the Persian period. We're finally starting the intertestamental period. How long have we been here? 3 weeks? I want to note a couple things about this. You see where the dark green is? This area, let's see if we can get up here. What's this area? It's Egypt, right? What's this area? Iran, Iraq. Yeah, that's right. I want you to notice this tiny little land bridge between those two. You're going to see that from now on. In every empire we look at, you're going to see this tiny little land bridge. Well, why didn't they just go ahead and take all this stuff too? It's desert. The land bridge becomes critical. And as I said, you're going to see it in all the other kingdoms as we get to them. So let me ask you this question, kind of as an aside. Did you ever wonder why Israel? Did you ever wonder why Israel? Well, let me give you a couple of answers for that. Well, first of all, Israel's tiny. Israel won't even show up on this map. It's about the size of the state of New Jersey. To put it in perspective, you could put 13 Israels in Colorado if you took the same land mass. So it's a tiny little place. So why is it so important? Well, you just pointed out part of the reason. To the east is what? The Arabian Desert. To the west is what? The Mediterranean Sea. The only way that you could get by land from Egypt to the places north and east was this tiny little land bridge. So Israel wasn't important because it was Israel. Israel just happened to be in the way of everything that everybody wanted. That's why they're conquered over and over and over. It didn't have anything to do with Israel. It had to do with the fact that they were the ones that controlled that. They didn't control. They were the ones in that little corridor. That's why they become so important. Does anybody remember, I think this was in the fifth grade. Does anybody ever remember learning about the Fertile Crescent? Sam?
Middle school math. Good days.
You probably remember them better than I do.
I don't know about that.
Well, for me, it was years ago. So the Fertile Crescent was basically what we see right here. Egypt, the breadbasket of the world, communicated with everything here through this little tiny land bridge. And we're going to see, not only here, not only in this empire, but on all the rest of them, this is going to be a struggle between Egypt and this area, and poor little Israel is going to be in the middle of it. Not only that, there are a couple of things that we need to know about what was going on in Israel by this time, and certainly by Jesus' time, and that is this. We'll get to it later as well. We'll see a better picture of it later. In Israel, and it would have been Israel at the time, now it's in Jordan, across the Jordan River and up on the plateau is something called the King's Highway. The King's Highway in Roman times and in this period of time was the only major thoroughfare north to south. And guess where it started? It started in Egypt, went through Israel, and then went further north. So the main source of any kind of commerce would have been through Israel on the King's Highway. Not only that, but in Israel at the time, there were several ports along the Mediterranean where ships coming from across the Mediterranean would land, and then what would happen? They would take their wares east, and wares from the east they would take to the ports to the west. So places like Jaffa, Echo, Caesarea, Tyre, all those were critical ports all along this coast right here. So if you think Israel was important because it was Israel, it wasn't. Israel was important because it was the key to trade. It was the key to movement of everything between Egypt and the continent. Everybody following me? While we're on this little map, I want you to notice something. The title of this is called the Achaemenid Empire. Achaemenes was an ancestor of Cyrus the Great. So beginning with Cyrus the Great and subsequently those Persian rulers are all going to be called Achaemenids. So you sometimes will see that and you'll say, well, who is it? That's why it's called that. He's a progenitor of Cyrus the Great. During the time of Persian rule, relatively quiet. In fact, it was relatively quiet from the time of the Babylonian conquest and restoration. Very little is recorded by the chief historian Josephus in Israel. The last of the prophets is going to be Malachi in about 430 BC. So control at this point is maintained by the Persians, but they pretty much let Israel do their own thing. With this exception, they were taxed very heavily. But they were allowed to carry on their religious observances, and they were ruled by a high priest who was also responsible for the Jewish government. So while Israel is a conquered nation, the northern kingdom had been ruled by the Assyrians, the southern kingdom by the Babylonians, and now the Persians. So they get ruled by a number of different kingdoms, and most of them don't have any problems with them and allow them to continue their religious observance, provided they do what? Pay their taxes. There's another theme we'll hear continuously up to today. Pay your taxes. Except that we aren't allowed religious freedom. I told you there'd be a little political commentary as we went along here. In the waning years of the 4th century, the Persian rule begins to wane, and that's probably because of the impending strength of the Greeks. The Greeks are starting to flex their muscles. Phoenicia, this little coastline that we have here, Phoenicia would be right about here. So Phoenicia was north and east of Israel, modern-day Lebanon. They revolt against the Persians and their overlords, likely followed by Israel, trying to overthrow them as well. Artaxerxes III, who was a Persian ruler, he deported a substantial number of Jews to a place called Harkenia in the Caspian Sea. Right there. Do you remember when we were Remember when we talked about the word diaspora? Here's another phase of the diaspora. Under the Persians, Jews were taken captive as a result of the revolt and moved again out of the country. They are going to be in what would ultimately be where Paul's going to write his letter to the Galatians at some point in the future. In 359 BC, and everybody's remembering all these dates? You've got them all right here, right? 359 BC. So we've leaped forward a couple hundred years. Philip of Macedonia ascends to power and was able to unite several Macedonian and Greek city-states, including Athens, Sparta, Macedon, Delphi, and Corinth, who'd been at war with each other. These little city-states warred with each other, and they're all located fairly close to each other, had warred with each other for generations. And if you have heard the term Peloponnesian Wars, this was the period of time that this would have occurred. So Philip II is able to unite all of these various tribes, primarily to deal with the Persians. The Persians are trying to force their way, as you can see right here. The Persians are trying to force their way into Greece. They have conquered what you see here. This is the Persian Empire. They want to move things further west and at some point, possibly further east, although you don't really see much happening in this area, even with Alexander the Great. The Persians are threatening the Macedonians and the Greeks. So Philip II combines these guys, and they become a great power under Philip. And guess who just happens to be Philip's son? Anybody want to guess? Alexander the Great. So Philip's Macedonian Empire is what you see here. And the kind of blue would have been Macedonia. He eventually extends it to the Nicopolis, I can't read that other one, but basically Thrace, and down to the Salt. So ultimately, that will be Philip's empire. But he leaves it to his best general, his top general, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is going to conquer the last of the Persians in this area. He overwhelms them and conquers them at something called the Battle of Gaugamela, which today would be Iraq or Kurdistan. Israel and Judah, and I want you to listen to this, Israel and Judah are going to, from this point on, are going to be known as Judea. They were among the countries that passed into Alexander the Great's hands. This is important, and I want you to notice why. For the first time in 3,000 years of Near Eastern rule and culture come to an end. This is the beginning of Western thought in Israel. Everybody following me? This is not an insignificant thing. We aren't going to spend a whole lot of time on philosophy, but Eastern and Western thought are quite different. And if you want to spend some time looking at it, you'll see why. But this is the point when Israel will pass into Western philosophy, Western thought, and eventually Western language. Now we're to the next period that Daniel had talked about. That's going to be the Hellenistic period. He didn't call it that. What did he call it? You remember? The Greek Empire. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Alexander the Great. Sarah?
So when did Israel got uprooted again to where
No. Well, what happened was when the Phoenicians and what's in Israel at the time, they revolt against the Persians. The Persians come back in and they conquer both of them. Some of Israel is carried into what will become Galatia, just south of the Caspian Sea. When Paul goes into Galatia, when you read Galatians, as an example, when he goes into, in his first missionary journey, those are some of the people he's going to be bumping into. Those are Jews who were displaced as a result of their revolt against the Persians, but they didn't take all of them. In fact, in none of the diaspora are all of the Israelites taken. And you know what you typically read? The poorest were left there to take care of the land. So there's still Israelites, there are still Jews in Israel at the time, so a portion of them, those who revolted, were taken into captivity. That makes sense?
So they're still there during.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yep. In fact, some were even left by the Assyrians. Some were left by the Babylonians. So when we think about the dispersion, don't think about it, all of them going. Think about a fairly large portion, but they always leave someone there to do the dirty work. They always leave someone there to, tend the fields, take care of whatever it is, and to tax. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about that we probably should have was after the exile. And the exile is when Babylonia carries the Jews into captivity in 586. What happened 70 years later? The return, right? You remember, and you'll find it in Jeremiah where he says, in 70 years, I'll bring you out of captivity. And he resettles Israel with Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel. He resettles them, but when he does, there's only about 50,000 Jews that resettle the conquered area. The remaining 1.5 million, or however many they were, stay in Babylonia and every place else. So Sarah, by the time this occurs, by the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, so let's call it 450-ish, there are Jews back in the promised land who have once again joined forces with the Jews that were left there by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. So some were carried into captivity, but there's still some kind of in the homeland. Does that help? Yeah. By the way, you guys should ask for credit for this. I mean, go to a history class up there and say, look, can we get credit for this?
About right.
So the ones that remained in Israel, would they be considered the remnant?
To a degree, but a lot of people use that term, the remnant, when they talk about the 10 tribes of Israel. So you could say it's a remnant, because a remnant is anything that's left over, right? So the group that's left there, is relatively small until they're brought back out of exile, is going to be this kind of 50,000 or so. Plus, remember, who's in Samaria? The Samaritans are kind of half-breeds, right? So that's who's in the land when all this occurs. Let's see.
This really starts to show how strategic God is. The chosen people, founded actually by Abraham, but where he placed them was on the connections between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And they are to be his ambassadors to spread the word. That was very strategic.
Bingo.
Center of the world, man.
Yep. Yeah. Now you know why I said I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in providence. Now, are you beginning? Hopefully, everybody's seeing when we talk about why this period is so important. What is occurring? How God is using all of these things to set up exactly what He wants to have happen for the birth, death, resurrection of His Son, and then the spread of the gospel. Are you seeing it? And everybody said, amen. One of you didn't say amen. So let's move on and see if we can. Oh my goodness, maybe we won't move on. I didn't realize. Who was timekeeper tonight?
You.
Yeah.
By default.
I didn't do a very good job of timekeeping. Actually, this is a good place to start because we're up to what's called the Hellenistic period, and that's Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's a huge issue. So why don't we wait until next week to deal with Alexander the Great? Is everybody okay with that? And once again, everybody said? Amen. All right. Let's see then. Why don't we end for this evening? Miss Marilyn, you do this every time we get to the end of the evening. You look down like I'm not going to call on you. And you know that I do, so you should probably just stand up and start saying it. So would you be so kind?